All right. Well, hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm really happy that I get to go first because you have plenty of time to forget about my mistakes by the end of the conference. And also, your minds are bright and open to new ideas still. So, my name is Andy Mockler. I work at Shopify. I'm a front-end developer there. Work on our core insights team, mostly on our analytics product. So I help build good analytics experiences for our merchants and help them understand their data so that they can build better businesses. And my team is based here in Ottawa, so I come up here somewhat frequently, but I currently live in Chicago in the US. I love it there. Lake Michigan is awesome. And yeah, so that's a little bit about me. And as we said before, the title of my talk is "The Best Way to Do More is to Do Less." And most of the ideas from this talk, I need to give credit where credit is due. They come from this book, Essentialism by Greg McKeown. I read this book at the beginning of this year at the suggestion of my mother-in-law, and honestly, it changed my outlook on like most of the things I do in my life. It was like, I didn't expect it to be that good. I like sort of read it just because I had nothing else to read at the time, but it was amazing. And so I highly recommend this. If you're interested at all in what I talk about today, he explains it even better in this, and it's a little more applied to like personal life and stuff like that. So recommend that. All right, so a brief intro to essentialist thinking. This is just an excerpt from like the summary of the book. So this is what Greg McKeown says essentialism is. The way of the essentialist isn't about getting more done in less time. It's about getting only the right things done. It is not a time management strategy or a productivity technique. It is a systematic discipline for discerning what is absolutely essential, then eliminating everything that is not, so we can make the highest possible contribution towards the things that really matter. So when I talk about us doing more by doing less, it's not necessarily like productivity hacks or anything like that. It's about discerning the things that we actually need to do and then doing a good job at doing those few things. And so I wanted to start with something that's sort of familiar to us, and I have a few examples of user experiences that I think really nail this concept of essentialism, of making the user do less, but helping them do more by doing less. So the first one, and I'm like way obsessed with this example. I'll try not to blabber about it for too long. But this is a screenshot from The Office on Netflix, and you'll see here that we have this little skip intro button. If you don't know what the skip intro button is, when you're watching a TV show and like the theme song starts, the skip intro button pops up, and on most clients it's auto-focused, and you can just click it and it'll like skip ahead 15 or 20 seconds so you don't have to hear the same theme song over and over again. I've thought a lot about this skip intro button. I think it's really interesting that like when they were in their first design meetings at Netflix, or whoever had this idea was thinking about it, there were like a million things they could have done here. Like they could have made this big overlay that comes over the intro screen that like lets you skip to like the highlights of the episode, or like for The Office, maybe it's like the most famous jokes or something. You know, there's a lot that they could have done, but instead they opted for this super simple UI. In fact, it only shows the rest of the UI because I was taking a screenshot. Like normally you're watching the show and then all that pops up and changes is that little skip intro button. And I think this is awesome because it gives you as the user like this superpower to be able to skip over that intro and like get to the task at hand, which is watch the actual episode, not the theme song over and over again. But it doesn't complicate it at all. And it suggests it at the exact right moment. Anyway, I think it's a beautiful thing. The next one, I know that this one's probably a little more controversial, but we'll talk about like Apple's vision with Face ID. So I think Face ID is awesome, especially when you consider its history. So like the iPhone had a home button, and then they decided that they wanted to give people a better way to, you know, authenticate with their phone and a little more security, so we had Touch ID. And that was a great example of like, you already clicked the home button, and so we'll just click the home button, but now there's a fingerprint reader in it. And Face ID is like another iteration of that, where they wanted us to do even less. Like now you don't even have to click a button. You just look at your phone and it'll show you your notifications once you look at it, or like presumably you're already looking at it so it can authenticate that way. And you get more security if you believe their numbers for actually doing fewer actions. So I think that this is an awesome example of like we as users are empowered to do more and to do it faster by doing fewer things and by doing less. And then the last example, I know these screenshots are super hard to see, this one and the next one, but this is a Medium article. This is like a full page screenshot of this Medium article. And on Medium, they do a great job of discerning what is absolutely essential on their pages. So this is an article page, and you'll see that literally everything on this page has to do with the article. There's the author's name, and then the title, and the body content, and then there's like 3 suggested articles. I can do some interactions, I can comment, or I can clap, and like that's it. That's the whole page. And I bring this up to compare and contrast with CNN, which it goes way off the bottom of the screen. This is only like half the screenshot when I took the full page screenshot. It's an article of comparable length, but the page is like way huger. There's this autoplay video at the top that like doesn't add anything to the article really. It's just there to be there. There's like 1,000 ads on the page. And so if CNN's essential intent here is for me to see ads, then like this page is nailing it. Like that's awesome. I saw a lot of ads when I came to this page. But really as the user, what I want the essential intent to be is to read this interesting article about space stuff. And so this is an example of where that maybe isn't done quite as well as it was on Medium. All right, so I'll talk about 2 guidelines here that we can kind of lift out, and then we'll talk about how this relates to the code that we write. So the first one is focus on the essential task. You'll hear me say that a lot in the next few minutes. So really what you need to do is you need to boil down whatever the task is to what, the very essential, the very bare bones, and then start deciding what you're gonna do from there. So for Face ID, the essential task here wasn't to read a fingerprint. It wasn't to, like open the iPhone or whatever. It was to authenticate the user. And so they really were able to pare it down to this essential task of authentication and then come up with something new that made the user do less but gave them more abilities. And then the second one is take time to think. So if you get nothing else out of this talk, you should remember that like the best way to do this, the best way to start doing more is to take more time to think and to spend less time actually doing the solution. And that's very counterintuitive, but Greg McKeown in his book talks a lot about how even though essentialists do less, they explore far more possibilities than people who don't live this way of life. So this kind of goes back to the skip intro button for me. Like, I feel like to make that decision, there had to be a lot of thought that went into it. There had to be some thought about like, oh, I don't want to like watch this intro over and over again, and what might a solution to that look like? And a lot of thought around exploring all those different solutions that the user could do to be able to skip the intro, and then finally deciding on that one once a lot of thought had been put into it. And I feel pretty valid in thinking that because the skip intro button has been around for a while now. And when it first came out, I sort of expected it to like evolve into that nasty UI that wasn't going to be very helpful, but like it has consciously stayed just that button. And I think that taking time to think is what leads us to be able to really nail those solutions and then not screw them up later. All right, so let's talk about JavaScript a little bit. So we should make our code do less. So when we're designing products, we should think about our users doing less, we should think about our pages doing less, and really nailing that essential intent. But that same thing applies to the code we write every day. And we're really lucky as JavaScript developers that we have NPM and sort of this mantra of these small modules that do one thing really well. And you can find all kinds of modules on NPM that are like 20-line packages or whatever. And I think like LeftPad is like the classic example that people always use of like just this tiny, tiny package that does something that many other applications can use. And so here's a great example for me. It's sample from the Lodash package. I think Lodash is like the most essentialist package of all time. If you look at the source code, it's like a very flat structure. All of the utilities that are public are like in the root, so you can see them right away. Every utility is in one file, which is awesome. So like if I go into, this is the whole file for Lodash sample. And so if I go in here, I like get the documentation, and then there's 2 lines of code that are like really easy to understand, and then it's finished. And obviously, like, lines of code is not the best heuristic for this. I could write like a one-liner that's impossible to understand and does a million things, and like that's no good either. But I think that here we see that it really nails that idea of knowing its essential intent and then following through with only that. All right, so I write a lot of React code, so I'm going to use React as an example. Obviously, this applies to any framework that you're using or any not framework that you're using. But I think that this idea of modules and components really lends itself well to doing more by doing less. We can see here that we have this button component, and it does more than one thing, and it's more than 2 lines. So it sort of fails that like fake heuristic that we had with Lodash sample, but it still succeeds at being essentialist. So when we want this button component, really what we want it to do is render a button and render some markup and nothing else. We don't want it to be tied to anything else in our application. And there might be a couple other things we do want it to do. So like this one sets a default color, and it also logs clicks to this fake analytics module that I have at the top that I'm importing. So again, essentialism isn't necessarily about doing only one thing. I think that it is about doing only one intent. So here our intent is to render this button. But really what we want to do is boil down this task until we have something very consumable and easy to understand. All right, so I have a couple suggestions of what we can do to keep our code maintainable and keep it sort of essentialist in this way. And the first one is to look for seams and to find the seams. So if we go back to this component, I want to talk a little more about that fake log click line about halfway through. We can imagine that at one point that was, maybe 5 or 10 or 20 lines that was making an AJAX request to log these click events whenever a user clicks on the button. But by looking for seams, we can find places where code is independent of the things around it, and then we can factor it out or we can pull it out into other modules so that each module has one essential intent. So that analytics module, for example, its one intent now is to log those clicks. And it doesn't do anything else. It doesn't worry about the fact that it logs them when a button is clicked. It doesn't worry about the fact that the button is green or the button is blue or whatever else. It really just worries about logging that click event. And same for our button. Our button doesn't have to worry about making an AJAX request or about what the host of the analytics server is or anything else. It just worries about logging that click event because that is the one thing that it intends to do. The second thing is building what we understand. So when we think about having an essential intent, we really can't have one essential intent, one priority, if we're trying to prioritize for things in the future that we don't quite understand yet. We want to try to do fewer things. And if we're doing things in the future, then we automatically have violated the principle of doing like the minimum. And I think a lot of times it's very difficult to not build what we don't understand. That was too many negatives. It's difficult to only build what we understand because we see opportunities to maybe save ourselves in the future or to add one more feature or do one extra small thing. And really, when it comes down to it, what normally happens is when we go back to use that feature we built 6 months later, we realize that we didn't understand the problem, and so that code we wrote is not useful for whatever we're doing. So when we do less, this kind of goes back to the old adage of like the best programmers are lazy. We should always try to only do what we understand and not go past that boundary. So only do exactly what we have a clear use case for. I think, again, to talk about Netflix skip intro or Face ID again, those are tasks that either haven't iterated because the user doesn't need to do more things, or with Face ID, something that has iterated because we understand a little better how users are authenticating with their phone and how they might want that kind of security for free or not for free. Can we trust our users to be secure, or do we have to give it to them in a way that they can't say no to, things like that. Okay, so now we're back to these 2 things that I mentioned before, and this is really the most important thing. So the first one is focus on the essential task. Think about Lodash sample, or think about that button component when you're writing your code. What is the minimum that this module or this component can do and still succeed in in doing the essential task, in doing what is most important, and then taking time to think. So I think that the important part here is that we take a lot of time for self-reflection. Maybe we're tempted to add some options to Lodash-sample, but before we do it, before we dive in and start doing it, and this is probably the thing that I'm the worst at, that I need to take time to do. But we should really sit down and think about the use case and think about, is there maybe a separate module that can accomplish this task that could stay essential and could stay minimum? Is this really an important feature of the button component, or is there a way for us to compose different components together so that they don't get polluted? And as we add legitimate features to these things, taking time to look for those seams and look for opportunities to pull them apart. So maybe, I start having a lot of logic around changing the button different colors. And as that grows, I take the time to think about pulling that out into a separate module, or maybe divorcing it from the button component entirely, or whatever it needs to be. All right, and then my final point is that it can be really hard to say no to these things. It can be really hard to say no to adding a new feature to our page, or to adding another ad to the page in CNN's case, or to adding those videos, because we put a lot of work into getting the videos to autoplay on every platform or whatever it may be. But the important thing is to just say no. And again, I'm going to plug Greg McEwen here. He talks a lot about how we always fear when we're saying no that we'll lose the respect of other people, but really we gain the respect of other people as we do this. I think about the products that are the most essential, and they're often the ones that I respect the most. Like, I love reading articles on Medium. They're awesome. And like, Medium lacks a lot of features that other, article or news sites or blogs may have, but it's an excellent experience for me, and it does exactly what it needs to do, and it does it very well. And if we become those sorts of developers, if we write that kind of code, then people will come there and they'll see that what we do is done very well. And even if there's less total projects, they're all finished, and finished in a very good way, instead of having 1,000 things that are only partly finished. So thank you very much for listening. Again, I'm Andy Mockler. You can find me anywhere at AS Mockler, and enjoy the rest of the talks.